Excellent. Well, it is 10 o'clock. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Um, Today we are joined by Joachim Wiersma and Andy Linder, and we're going to be talking about small grains. And so today, what we'll do, we'll have the guys present. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for discussion and questions. And just a quick overview of using Zoom controls. If you take your cursor, your pointer, and hover over your screen, on the bottom left, you'll find your mute button. That's where you can mute and unmute. And after the break, we can unmute to have discussions. And then also you can start or stop your video down there. And then also at the bottom in the center, there's the chat box. And if you click that, you can write in a question to everyone or just to certain people. So in the first half, you can put your questions in the chat box, or you can save them until after the break and unmute and ask them verbally. You can always use the chat box though, if you prefer that. All right. So without further ado, we're going to get started. Joachim is going to provide information on um, his experience and his work in small grains. Um, and we're really excited to have both these guys with us today because they know exactly what they're talking about with small grains. So thank you guys and take it away, Joachim.
Okay, I'll see if I can grab your screen. I'll go from here, share. Okay, let's see if this now works. Did everybody see the share screen going back and forth?
Yes.
Good. Well, then we're live now. Oh darn. Well, I'll introduce myself. I'm Joachim Wiersma, working from an undisclosed location somewhere in northwest Minnesota, um, known as my basement. Um, I've been with the university for now 25 years as the small grains extension agronomist. And obviously, they booted me up to Northwest Minnesota and not in St. Paul because the majority of the small grain acreage is in Northwest Minnesota. Now, believe it or not, at one time, there was, just as a little tidbit, 300,000 acres of barley between the Twin Cities and the Iowa border in southeast Minnesota. Might have something to do, and this was before Prohibition, that might have something to do with every single town where Germans had settled, there also being a brewery. Um, this biggest malt house actually in the world now, I believe, is still just south of the cities. Raar Malting in Shakopee is still the largest malter in the U.S. Now, they don't source any barley anymore, uh, really in the region. It all comes from Western North Dakota and Canada. Um, but small grains were part of why Minneapolis is called Mill City. It wasn't until corn made it further north that eventually small grains moved north and west. It wasn't until the railroads basically that we think of the Red River Valley as the grain basket of the world. And so small grains have been on your landscape before. They've been just replaced by corn and beans in as far as we can remember, because we're all whippersnappers, right? So um, this whole, when I get asked by a soil health coalition, I have to give you some definitions just as much because I'm just an agronomist. Okay. I got trained as a breeder. I always look through the lens of genetics when I look at my research. Um, but soil health, soil quality is the continued capacity of soil to function to support basically plants, animals, and humans. And the soil biota is all the microorganisms that are just having a heyday in there, um, that are part of that soil. Now, this portion of the program is brought to you by eCards because I get accused often of being a damn cynical bastard. Um, I am not a woohoo type. I'm a data type. Show me the data is generally the second sentence you hear from me. So the question I have for you that I want you to, do you really need soil to produce plant-based food, fiber, and feed? Do you actually need soil? Hydroponics would argue no. All the lettuce on Hawaii apparently is produced on one hillside somewhere on, I think it's the Big Island actually, that's hydroponically done. Gravity just runs the water down the little troughs and they produce all the lettuce hydroponically. If you go to the greenhouses in the Netherlands, they produce a lot of the tomatoes are produced hydroponically. They don't have any soil. Um, does a healthy soil, and we can argue about health and what health means in this context, eliminate nitrogen leaching completely? Some of you should be shaking your head now, um, kind of like this rather than this, because we've always there, and this is something that we have to recognize. Um, nutrients have always moved. Nutrient cycling happens. The extent to which may differ from what it did 100 years ago when this was prairie, 150 years ago, but we've always had nutrient cycling and movement of nutrients. So does a healthy soil eliminate wind, water, erosion completely? It reduces it greatly, but I don't think it completely eliminates it. So, and then the question that is also, when we talk about resiliency and soil communities, how resilient are soil communities? All those different soil communities. There's some really interesting work going on actually, because those soil communities, for instance, may explain why we have rotational benefits. And there's some really cool work actually going on at the University of Wisconsin in that really long-term trial. And one of the things that they're finding is that those communities are very resilient. It's amazing how resilient they are. And so it takes a lot to really disturb soil communities over a longer period. Now, I didn't talk about organic matter at all in this. And I have to quote Ray Almaris, a retired and since then passed away soil scientist. Organic matter is your savings account in the soil. Depleting organic matter is depleting basically your savings account. Now, and so thinking about those things, why is all the hubbub about soil health now, right now? And this because it's the biggest buzzword you hear right now. Every single grant that I should be part of somewhere has an aspect of soil health associated with it. Your existence as a organization is because there is this attention. The question, and this is the cynical bastard that I am, is are we actually losing productivity in our major commodities? Is our soil health completely collapsing to the point that we're losing productivity? I'm not so sure. Is it simply because it's fashionable, or what the French would call the issue du jour, kind of like bell bottoms and leisure shoots? We got over those two things, thankfully. Or is it really a proxy for a larger issue? Is it a substitute for where society is with how farming is done? compared to 2 generations ago or 3 generations ago, where you had much more integrated systems rather than these very efficient, very specialized operations that are today. We have complete separation of livestock operations for the most part and cropping systems. We have very good corn producers that are, and soybean producers. We have very good hog producers, but they're not always completely integrated anymore. And so, and I don't know if I would call that, and these are just things I want you to think about. This is the cynical bastard in me. If I take a very long view, and this is truly brainstorming, okay? This is nothing relevant to today. But think of this. If the phosphorus mines in Florida run dry, and we have to start importing phosphorus out of Morocco, China, or Brazil, where is the price point where it becomes advantageous to you to concentrate phosphorus through an animal and not haul that manure more than 10 miles? Because hauling manure is like carrying water to the ocean. It's somewhat an exercise in futility. So when you start thinking, and this might be 50 years down the road, okay, but then you would want livestock close to you because that's how it was done before we started mining phosphorus and bringing it up the Mississippi on a barge. So this is your food for thought. And I know it's really early. This should, these kind of muses you should have at 11 o'clock at night after a couple of beers. But as I was putting this together, no, I did not have any whiskey or beer putting this talk together, but those are some of the things that I, think about. So if we talk about ecosystem services, it's actually is defined as the benefit to humans provided by healthy ecosystems. It says nothing about whether or not there's a benefit to the plants and the biota. It's truly, the definition at least says it's benefit to the humans. And I think it's been co-opted or switched a little bit, or I don't think necessarily call it misinterpretation, where we think of ecosystem services as ways to create benefits to the soil and the production landscape. We have to recognize that any acre that we farm is a disturbed ecosystem by definition. It's not a natural ecosystem. But within that, we can do things certain ways right and certain ways wrong. So, but when people start talking, especially those that don't farm, about you ought to, whenever I used to teach a section on bioethics, and whenever somebody uses the word ought, that implies a moral obligation. You ought to do this. You shall not do that. So the question then becomes, does a landowner or a producer have and I'll put it in small letters, moral obligation to provide ecosystem services, aka maintaining this, healthy ecosystem for his or her fellow humans to enjoy? In other words, is he obligated to forfeit part of his income or her income just so others benefit? Is it in the land, and a related question to that, is it in the landowner or renter's, producer's best selfish interest to maintain the innate productivity of his or her capital asset? Because that's what ground is for you. It's a capital asset. And I go back to what Ray Almaris said, your soil organic matter is your savings account. Do you want to keep that savings account at a certain balance, or do you want to deplete that over time? Things to ponder. Okay, now let's get back to, the reality of small grains. Just, why do we, what does the soil do for us? Nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, predation of wheat seeds, for instance, waste decomposition and detoxification. I have a rule, whenever I do a herbicide trial, none of the treatments, if I have a little bit left of a certain treatment, none of that comes back to the station. You know why? Because if I bring it back to the...
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we get started...
That wasn't me, I hope. I bring nothing back because the moment I bring it back, it's chemical waste. And I have a whole bunch of paperwork associated with it. If I spray it out in the alleyway, the soil will take care of it because it detoxifies. In some cases, a soil applied residual herbicide, yeah, I might find that, and if I do certain things the next year, but that's what the soil does for me. Purification of water and air. That's why we have good quality drinking water. The dunes, the sand dunes in front of Amsterdam, as you fly in over, to Schiphol Airport, those dunes, that's basically the drinking water supply. And they pump dirty water on top of the dunes, and they pump it out as drinking water. Pest and disease control and flood protection. I look at soil health and look at no-till systems and as ways basically of risk management, risk mitigation, resiliency. And it's a little bit longer view than you have with your banker. Your banker's risk horizon is 1 year. He or she wants to make sure that you can pay back your notes 12 months from now in the case of an operating loan. And so that's a shorter time frame than biological systems. And that's where I think a lot of times the rub is. So everybody wants to play a cover crop these days. Okay, if you do that after corn and beans, that rye plant, however sturdy it is not very capable of doing anything in the fall because it's too small. It's going to have 5, maybe 10 pounds of nitrogen in that green biomass before hell freezes over in Minnesota. Likewise, if we have a little bit later spring, you really have to wait until you get into what I would call the 6, basically past jointing, to where you have stem elongation, to where it actually can take up nitrates and make a noticeable difference in the amount of nitrate lost through runoff. A small plant can't take up 200 pounds of nitrates that's in the soil profile, or even 70 pounds. They're going to be relatively small. And so if you put a rye cover crop in before corn, after soybeans, but before corn, you terminate it too early. If you do it before soybeans, so after corn, before soybeans, you actually probably shouldn't crimp that until you're basically well into the month of June. Or it's not going to take up any of that nitrate that corn was sloppy with and left behind. So given those constraints, are winter annuals as a cover crop a Band-Aid on an arterial bleed? because we have to recognize this is one of the most extreme climates to farm in. We can be minus 40 in January, and we can in Celsius or Fahrenheit, because that's the equivalent, and we can be a frickin' 100 degrees 4 months later. There's very few places in the world that are that extreme, and we farm this land in one of the shortest windows that we have. You know, nothing happens, for instance, in the Red River Valley until pretty much May 1st. And we're lucky to get the sugar beets out and the corn out in the second week, by the second week of October, because we can have the world frozen shut after that. There's very few places in the world that do that much in that a short amount of time. So if winter annuals as a cover crop, if you want to maximize grain yield for corn and beans in a conventional system, a organic system is a different ballgame because your price points are completely different. But in the conventional commodity system, cover crops almost are a Band-Aid because I don't think they can make enough difference. So if that's the case, let's go to plan B. Instead of thinking of small grains just as a seed expense to create a cover, let's just treat it as a crop. Okay, I'm selfish here and I'm biased. And think of it as a form of income that you get out of the crop itself rather than just milking a subsidy stream. I know that's a very dirty word to, which is why I put it in very small print, okay? If we just look at crop rotation in of itself and we treat it as a crop rotation works, okay? Now, the reason we have a corn soybean system across all the I states and now Minnesota all the way up to the Canadian border and now all the way up to the Missouri River in South Dakota and North Dakota is for one reason and one reason only. And the research points it out every single time. I have to admit, begrudgingly, because I'm the small grain specialist, corn really only needs a 1-year break. Every single time we do the research, corn is perfectly happy with just having a 1-year break. All problems disappear. The only one right now that is putting a little bit of a ding in that is corn rootworm, because we've very effectively in the corn soybean rotation selected, aka sped up evolution, with the extended diapause. Now, with the advent of the transgenics, we staved off that problem for a while of the extended diapause. But some of the stacks are starting to fail. And so lay-by insecticides are now going to be needed again in some cases, in certain populations, to not have disasters. Okay. So corn is amazing. I'll be the first one to admit that, begrudgingly. Now, all the other crops, soybeans, wheat, rye, barley, oats, all need a 2-year break at least. If you would include flax, I could tell you flax needs a 7-year rotation to really shine. Flax has a soil-borne pathogen. Once you have it, you're pretty much done for a generation. And so growers have learned in the Netherlands and in other parts, 7-year break. You don't come back with flax in that field 1 but 7 years. Potatoes, similarly. Sugar beets, probably 4-year breaks because of soil pathogens. But soybean, wheat, and barley and oats, as long as we don't get take all, probably 2 years. Soybean cyst nematode, once your egg count is too high, 2 years isn't enough. So this is my blatant pitch, an opportunity cost. the cost of any activity measured in terms of the value of the next best alternative foregone. Huh? What? Basically, every single year you have the option to rent your ground out or farm it yourself. Your rent is your opportunity cost. You have to exceed the rent for you to farm. Otherwise, you're better off renting it out. Okay, I interpreted that, and I see Andy just kind of just mulling this over quick. You should turn your video off. Then, I can't pick on you. I reinterpreted this for the sake of rotational. The monetary advantage resulting from rotational choices when compared to a monoculture should, please do, be assigned to the previous crops that are not included in the enterprise analysis of the crop itself. So all of us are cheating every single year when we put our crop budgets together because we put our highest corn and our highest soybean yields in it. Because otherwise the banker is going to look at you going, are you sure? Well, that last 20 bushels in your corn enterprise, you didn't get because you grew corn on that ground the previous year. You grew that 20 bushels because you grew soybeans on those acres. That's the opportunity cost. And so those 20 bushels in that corn enterprise really ought to go to your rotational partner. Now, every single economist will tell you that's funny math. And they're right. But it's a way to start acknowledging that you can't do what you do with corn if it wasn't for rotational choices. And it's a mindset. So here comes the blatant sales pitch. To move away from a single enterprise frame of mind to keep your banker happy, and to move to a systems approach to keep your production system happy, I propose what? Wider rotations. And I will always recognize and admit that a small grain is going to be the black sheep in the family. Sorry. It's not going to be the silver bullet. It's not going to make you rich. But if we look at all these aspects, there are advantages of widening your rotation. And I don't like using this because it's a little bit philosophical. Everybody ever heard of the precautionary principle? It's a policy dogma of almost in the European Union. One ought not to do if one cannot oversee all of its consequences. Okay? There is an inherent flaw in logic in that. If we could oversee the consequence, it's no longer an unforeseen consequence. So there's a problem in the logic, but, and this is where I think of it more as conservative or risk adverse. I don't necessarily think there's always going to be a silver bullet that allows us to get out of the next pickle we got ourselves into. And we have a couple of really good examples of pickles that we gotten ourselves into because of the way our rotations have been. One of those is herbicide-resistant weeds, extended diapause corn rootworm. That is simply a function of how our prediction system was. It allowed for selection of, and that's the consequence. And I'm worried that we're running out of solutions. So if you do small grains, while no single management practice will greatly influence your outcome, an integrated system of small little things can substantially boost yield. very old publication from Ed Opplinger and Daniel Wiersma and Craig Grau and Keith Kelling at the University of Minnesota. I like this because basically what they're saying, there is no silver bullet. Pay attention to the little things. It's called farming. If you don't pay attention, it's gonna, small grain, just like beans or corn, are gonna be, your Achilles heel. And it's about, controlling cost. You're in a commodity system. It's about controlling cost always. Now, unfortunately, because our weed control programs have gotten a lot harder, we now have issues in the case of small grains with herbicide carryover. And especially with winter annuals, I've gotten into some ugly surprises. Did I put it in here? Where is it? No. It's not Prowl H2O. And it's in the premixes here, but Prowl can do a number on rye, even though the replant restrictions say they shouldn't, because your recrop interval has expired if you put the Prowl H2 on early enough. If you have a drier fall, and because the soils are colder when you plant a rye, that's enough to ding up your rye stands with very low carryover concentrations when you do a bioassay. So we have to really be careful with carryover on a bunch of our commonly used soil applied herbicides or residual soil activity. Now, the first thing you have to know about small grains is they like it like I like it. I grew up in the Netherlands, where we would get out of school during the spring if our temperature gauge got above 85 degrees. We got early release, kind of like a snow day here, because it never happened. 70 degrees is a warm summer day in the Netherlands. So if you look at wheat, barley, rye, anything above 40, we're good. Basically anything above 32, we're good. Optimum is really high 60s, low 70s, with wheat actually tolerating a little bit more heat. And the maxes are really in the low 80s, with wheat being slightly higher. So what does that tell you when you grow small grains in a climate like Minnesota? Really, the early bird gets the worm. And I'll show you what that means. So starch deposition under high temperatures, it's not necessarily the daytime highs that really curb yield. It's the nighttime highs that really do a number on small grains. So the rule I have is if you have to turn on the air conditioning to sleep comfortably at night, I'll just go fast. That's not small grains weather, period. That's going to cost you test weight. It's going to cost you yield. It's going to increase actually your grain protein content, because grain protein is less affected. If you look at the slope, the total deposition is less, but the deposition as a whole, as a ratio, stays about the same. And so we end up with higher grain protein. That's why we raise heart red spring wheat with 14% protein. We have a warmer, drier, hotter climate that gives us indeed high proteins. So the planting date, if you talk about small grains in the case of spring cereals, I don't care if the snow is flying, but if that ground is ready and you are no longer getting stuck, you go. If there's still frost underneath, don't sweat it. Planting delays decrease yield and test weight, especially in oats. So the question I always have, and this is a really interesting one that I learned very early in my career, why do many still plant oats after wheat or barley? If you go to Southern Maine and you talk to old timers, they will always tell you that they'll plant their oats last before they would plant, after they would plant wheat or barley. Why is that? You just learned that oats actually likes it a little bit cooler than wheat does. Okay, very simple. Oats never left the farm unless it did make grain. Wheat always left the farm as a commodity, but oats was fed. If you didn't make the test weight, I got to come across the first pig that really whines if it gets 32-pound test weight oats. They don't. And so it was about how do you manage that flow of grain? Does it stay on the farm or was it sold as a commodity? These days, it's all a commodity. Oats is very seldom added to rations because we've learned how to use soy meal and corn. So a bushel in what? Seeding rates. If you look at seeding rates, it's basically a trade-off between tillers per plant, ultimate heads per plant, and the population you start with. As the population goes up, the number of tillers go down, and your number of heads only slightly increases over time of over seeding rate. The sweet spot for most is here, 1.5 million seeds per acre. Why? If you go higher, you increase your risk of lodging, and it has to do with crown roots and brace roots, equivalent to brace roots in corn. If you have, for the winter cereals, this is probably the sweet spot. For hybrid rye, it's a little bit different. We'll get back to that. Here, you're too low. But there's enormous plasticity in small grains to cover up your mistakes. If you have stand reduction because your depth control wasn't good enough, the tillering, if it has enough time, will make up your mistakes. So you have an enormous amount of plasticity in spring wheat, barley, oats, and even more so with the winter cereals. So why is this not working? Okay. Grain protein versus grain yield. In the current recommendations for spring wheat, winter wheat, we have in a way, and barley and oats and rye pretty much respond the same way. We will maximize grain yield before we maximize grain protein. So in the case of barley, that means you actually have to really throttle it down, because if you add too much nitrogen, that crop is not going to make grain. Because in the case of malt barley, you want it not to be too high protein, somewhere between basically 10 and 12. Why? Because free protein in the wort means more filtering and plugged filters in the brew house. So in the case of barley, we have recommendations that really want us to be kind of here on the curve. In the case of spring wheat, we're almost a little bit past the optimum for yield because the market wants 14. And that's one of the things and that psychology of that is hard. I'll make a joke now. I'll make a joke now. If it's yellow, it's number 2 corn. If it has a hilum, it must be a soybean. Why? And what that means basically is when you bring those two commodities, you're very seldom are going to get discounted. For if it's yellow, it's number 2. If it has a hilum, it's a soybean. You're going to get nickeled and dimed with wheat, barley, and oats at the elevator. The psychology is not in your favor. Why? because it all goes into the food market right now. And those attributes, milling yield, functional quality, like in the case of barley or in the case of wheat, changes if it doesn't meet those specs, apart from the presence of vomitoxin or, like aflatoxin in corn. That's the hard part. Nobody likes to get to the elevator, had a contract for 550 and walk away with 480. Okay, you feel like you just got robbed. But you have to go back to the enterprise analysis. If that 480 still pencils, you did fine. Okay? So this comes back to this nitrogen, leaching part. The crop, and it doesn't matter for any of the small grains. Winter wheat and rye are going to be a little bit earlier, but the majority of the N is going to get taken up in June, when from stem elongation to heading. That's when these small grains suck up the nitrates, and they're very efficient at it. So, you darn nozzle heads. Fungicides are an integral part of actually raising good quality small grains. In the case of oats, you're controlling crown rust. In the case of winter wheat and spring wheat, you're controlling leaf rust, leaf spotting diseases, tan spot septoria, and you're suppressing Fusarium head blight. This is somewhat of a complicated slide, but the disease ratings are on the bottom of the individual varieties, and the yield gain by the use of fungicides, depending on the disease rating of the variety, over 10 years of trials in Minnesota at 4 locations. You're looking at, if you add that up, those 3 averages, you're looking at 15 plus bushels if you do this right on susceptible varieties. But consistently, we see 6 to 10 bushel advantages using fungicides in our trials if we have any diseases present. So, plan on using fungicides. Make it integral to your operation. And we have, luckily, disease forecasting that make life a lot easier, so you understand the risk of the diseases. And if you have questions about it, you call me. That's my job. So finally, some yield data. So winter wheat. If we look at Southern Min and we look at soil health, and we want to have a winter cover so we don't share all our organic matter and our nutrients with the folks in town, who complain that they have to wash windows now all winter because they can't see through them, and the sills are full of dirt, not soil. Look at the winter wheat yields this past year in La Center. 100 plus bushels in the plot. St. Paul, 110. Kimball, the previous year, 62, which is a sandbox. Lamberton, 80 bushels. And you look at the best ones in there, and they do about 10, 15% more. And I'm not going to go through all the varieties. If you're interested in winter wheat production, we can go over what good choices are for your operation. Now comes the fun one. I started looking at rye back in 2014 because of the cover crop craze. And Albert Lee Seed House, Mac Earhart, contacted me. He goes like, everybody wants rye seed, but that means I have to produce seed. Which one of these is the best to produce seed? And then I got interested in it and go like, okay, I can find all these old ones like Hazlitt and Dale of Ryman and Spooner and Musketeer and Renza Bruzi, etc. But I knew that the Europeans had moved to hybrids. So I got hybrids from 2 companies initially, and now I only have KWS hybrids in it. Look at the yields here. So La Center in 2020, 112 bushels per acre in the plots. And the hybrids show about, 40, 50% heterosis over the best over the best pure open pollinated varieties, and Danko did very well this past year. But if we look at Ryman, that's almost doubling the yield. That's an awful lot of bushels. Now, we're not doing this every single year in the trials, and much has to do with what happens in April. If we have a decent April where we actually are growing rather than having one more snowstorm, but everything is frozen shut for another 2 weeks, the rye does better. But I think rye has the potential, hybrid rye has the potential to do probably 120 plus bushels on average in Southern Maine. The question then is, what are you going to do with all that rye? We can't drink our way out of this problem. You know, rye whiskey is the hot thing right now, but you don't need a lot of acres to inundate the market with a lot of whiskey. If hybrid rye is to be a viable crop across the landscape, we have to have a feed market. Now, Pipestone Systems is working already on a feeding trial, as are some academic institutions, Ohio State, Kansas State, and Lee Johnston in Morris is also looking at feeding rye as a substitute in corn rations, in the ration of substituting corn out of the rations. And there is some push from some of the buyers, as I understand it, to indeed start looking at rye as a more sustainable alternative to corn production in rations. So, one more time. And you can disagree with me and voice it by, now unmute and go like, you're full of it. With that, questions. And I went way over time. See, this is why I should record my talks. Andy, I didn't leave you much time. Sorry.
No, but you set it up really well for what I have to say next. And it's all good information and things that we need to know if we're going to consider raising small grain.
Thank you. Any questions before I hand it over to Andy? Anything that you vehemently disagree with?
I'll comment that I disagree a little bit with the nitrate uptake in the cover crop. And I don't have numbers to show it. I have pictures. About 3 or 4 years ago, I did a nitrogen trial for the corn growers. They got their grant program, and it was a trial with 3 or 4 different rates and timings and such like that. And so the following spring, in the cereal rye cover crop that was put into those corn stalks in the fall, I could see those strips. So, the strips that had the heavier rate had a more dense, darker green colored rye, and the strips that had lighter rates were, a little more sparse and less green in color. Now, how much was that? I have no idea, because I didn't sample the plants themselves, but it showed me that this is doing something. Now, you can probably tell me to figure out how much, but at least it gave me satisfaction that it wasn't just throwing my money away.
No, but rye will take up nitrogen that's available. The graph is really about how much reduction in leaching is there. And there, the problem is that plant is too small in the fall, to actually start mining that nitrate that's below the root zone, because it's only going to go down maybe this much in the fall if you start too late. And in the spring, that's going to take a while. And in the meantime, our biggest time, the most risk we run for nitrate leaching is not in the month of April. It actually starts about mid-May through June, when the rainfall starts to increase. And at that point in time, we're terminating. It has nothing to do with that the crop can't find nitrates and won't use them. If there's a nitrate, it will find it and it will use it. And so that rate response that you saw has more to do with how much nitrogen was left in your corn that's left than it has to do with the corn, with the rye making a the rye will find that nitrate. But if it's a small plant and it's below a little bit lower already, it won't reduce the runoff. That's what that graph is about. It's not about the efficiency of the rye.
Okay.
Rye, all the small grains can probably take up about 10 pounds of nitrogen per day in that from the 5-leaf stage through about mid-boot, early heading. If you look at nitrogen uptake data, it's about 10 pounds of nitrate nitrogen per day in that 3-week period. It can gobble up, if it's there and its mass flow gets anywhere close to those roots, it will gobble it up.
So, Joachim, if I'm sitting here listening to you and myself when I'm done, and I say, well, okay, I want to try small grain. Which one do I try? Do you have one that you find is easier to manage than not, or easier to market than not? Where would you steer somebody who says, okay, I'm ready to try it, but which one do I try?
What is your gateway drug? Is that's what you're asking me?
Pretty much.
I think still spring wheat. I'm leaning between spring wheat and probably winter wheat, because you have to be set up for hauling it. That's because a lot of elevators, and we can have a whole discussion about elevators and why they went to unit trains and why they are only taking corn and beans these days. So a simple rule that a fella was from Lincoln. Is he from Lincoln? No, from Omaha, sorry. A fellow from Omaha that has a big ownership stake in BNSF made sure that the railroads got deregulated, and that has had a massive influence on how elevators now have to operate, which is why you see the massive concentration where elevators really can't afford to do one or two things, because they have to load a unit train in less than 24 hours or they're gonna get raked over the coals. So when you do all these smaller commodities, and it doesn't matter which one, or contracted crops, you have to haul it, because there's only few in your area that can handle it. And in that case, it means for wheat, you have to be willing to get it to Shakopee, to the barges at CHS, or to one of the local mills, whether that's New Prague, Winona, Mankato, or go north to Fargo, depending on where you're at. There's very few elevators, and that's the challenge also for you. Grain millers, for instance, buys a lot of oats, but they do it on contract nowadays. Why? Because we don't have and this is where farming is risk management. You know what my analogy for farming is? It's not a NASCAR race where the curve is coming up and all you have to do is throttle back a little bit to make it through the curve, and then you floor it again until the next curve comes, which is going to come. Farming is, if you go to the Speed Channel, they have European rally racing. Ever watch that? There's two guys in a car, 4-wheel drive, an Audi or something. There's two people sitting in that car, and there's the co-pilot that goes, well, Hank, in about 200 yards, there's going to be a 90-degree curve. And I think you can take it at about 90 miles an hour, but be aware there is a drop off of about 300 feet behind it. So if you miss it, we're up shit creek. Farming is the same way. It's split-second decisions with relatively large consequences with imperfect information. That's what farming is.
Very true.
And so when you have those contracts, you know, with grain millers and Shakopee, yeah, that means you have to haul it. And we don't have futures market. A futures market allows you, a viable futures market allows you to get price horizons. That is a risk management tool. In the case of oats, that is all but gone. In the case of spring wheat and winter wheat, we still have those futures market, which is why those are probably better entry points. Does that make sense?
It does. Thanks.
Okay. Chad had a question about populations. I'm taking way too much time already. See, extension guys get paid by the word. You didn't know what you got yourself into when you allowed me to go live. Chad, can I just answer that in the Q&A with just typing it? And we'll go from there, and then we'll come back later. Andy, I'll shut up now.
Okay. All right, can we see that?
Yep, looks great.
Did I do all that right?
It's perfect. You did a great job.
Okay. I'm not as versed at this Zoom stuff as Joachim is. I've haven't participated in too many of these meetings, and this is my first where I get to present on one, so bear with me on that. So cover crops and small grain. Joachim did a great job of kind of opening the book for us, and I kind of want to bring it down to the farm now on what we've been doing, how we've been doing it, and just give you a little insight on my experience with small grain. So my family, I got 3 kids and a wife. We are now living on the home farm, and my dad is still operating with us. Together, him and I cover about 800 acres. And 2 years ago, I believe, was when we finally got the whole farm to a 1/3 rotation. So we've been playing around with small grain for a while. And a couple years ago is when we finally got all the acres on a rotation to where we're going corn, soybeans, and then small grain. And last year now, we've even integrated some canning crop into that if we want to take a little risk out of the small grain acres. We used to have a lot of livestock, and with deterioration of buildings and labor, that a lot of that's gone away. And so my dad still feeds a few feeder cattle for fun and for the butcher shop. And recently we started getting into custom grazing on the cover crops. So we've started building fence and grazing cows or cattle for people that I can find who want to utilize my cover crop. I also started a cover crop business of selling and applying seed. Many of you maybe know that I have a high clearance seeder that I'm doing ground application with. I had last year off with some equipment issues, but we're going to be going forward with that for next year. And so that's what's keeping me busy. Where we came from, 2014 is the last year that I can remember that we did any deep tillage. And then we had purchased and utilized a sulfur vertical tillage tool, was what kind of transitioned us into the minimum tillage and no-till game. And so 14 was the last year that we deep tilled any ground. And then I got 19 there. That particular farm was 40 acres that was wet, and I got to experiment with the roller crimper on that field. Ideally, I'd like to do that every year, but not on the 1st of June planting soybeans. You know, it'd be fun if we could have rye like that, you know, on the 15th of May or 20th of May and still be planting and keep things going. But we still cover every acre. So what we do today, every acre gets a cover crop. Corn going to beans is usually a cereal rye and maybe a few brassicas in there if we're on some type of funding that we need to follow the EQIP and NRCS rules. And beans going to corn. Well, beans going to small grain or canning crop has been some type of winter kill mix. And then the small grain is where we get into the cocktails for the corn crop for next year. We've been doing some strip till. Last year, only a third of our corn acres got stripped. The rest was no-till corn. And all the beans are no-till. All the small grain is no-till. And the no-till, especially with the small grain, is really helped get in the field a lot more timely and early. You know, Yoakum said to get out there as soon as you can without the tractor being stuck. And in the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a few times that we have been able to no-till drill that small grain in before some type of rain or snow event came, where if we were trying to dig that soil and then go drill it, you know, that afternoon or the next day, it just would have never happened. All of our heavy machinery is sold. They got the picture of the 4-wheel drive leaving the yard. That was June of 18. And prior to that, it had actually sat in the shed for most of the previous years prior to 18. And so finally got the price we wanted for it, and that's left. We don't own any tillage equipment anymore either. So we're down to planter, tractor, harvesting equipment, and some other row crop stuff. So I said we no-till all the beans, the small grain, and I talked a little bit about the cattle grazing. I can get into that later too. So the third crop rotation, specifically with oats, we first planted oats in 2015 and scaled up in 2018. I like to plant 7 to 12 species of covers following those small grains. And once I'm paying for it all on my own, I may start to simplify that some, but we've been playing with these big cocktails for now because we're getting some money for planting the cover crops to play with it. So let's learn something while we're getting that money. And then when the money runs out, well, then let's figure out what worked and stick with it. Experimented with the grazing in 18. We bought 15 feeder cattle, backgrounded them for 2 months, sold them in mid-December, and put 2 pounds a day on some feeder cattle on just cover crop alone. I had a bale of hay out there for them if they wanted, and in 2 months' time, those 15 head didn't even eat that whole bale of hay. So strictly on the cover alone and water, we were able to put 2 pounds a day on and make some money on it. So then, you know, we liked that idea. So we started building fence in 19 and then again in 20. And what we've kind of been doing is every year that we have a small grain on a field that we own, we then put a fence around that field and then graze it that fall. And like I said, the last couple of years, we've been able to get neighbors or people locally to come in with their cows and pay us a rent or a per day for the feed that we're basically providing their animals and the chores that we're doing for them. And so far it's been working out really good for both parties. They get their cattle out of the dry lot. They don't have to feed hay and do chores, and we get the benefit of the animal on the landscape. So in the years that we've been doing the oats, our 5-year average was 113. That was our average prior to this last year. And if anybody out there did raise small grain last year, it was one of those great years for raising small grain. We had 120 to 135 bushel oats. And so that'll bring that 5-year average up a little bit. When I put a pencil to it, I figured roughly 115 bushel average at a 350 is break even for just the grain only on those oats. And so you're going to say, well, then why are you doing it? Well, here's what I kind of penciled out for expenses. And I tried to be really generous with these expenses. I put in trucking because, like Joachim said, we got to go somewhere with it. And most of the time ours have gone to St. Ansgar, which is about a 65 mile, 70 mile truck ride one way. And so we got the trucking expense in there. As of right now, we have not purchased any small grain equipment, and we do hire the combining done because I have some neighbors that have the dummy heads and the combine set up. So that's where that machine hire comes in at $55. Is we've been paying swathing and combining for now, partially because, you know, you say, well, you got the combine. Yes, we do. But I'm also trying to keep the grain away from those combines and manage everything in the yard. So it doesn't work out too bad to have somebody in the field getting that done before that next rainstorm comes in. I didn't put anything in for the cover crop yet, but that's an expense that you probably should add at some point. And so, you know, total expense before land, I'm coming up with $180 an acre on, this is on oats. So this is what Joachim was talking about, where, you know, applying that bang for your buck back to that crop. And so in the years that we were doing 25, 30 acres of oats at a time in splitting fields, I was able to compare how the corn did following the oats versus beans right next to it. And then I was also able to then compare how the beans did versus just a corn bean rotation next to the three crop. Corn bump, I saw as low as 8, but more consistently, I was 20 plus, as high as 26 bushel. And so I think what did I figure? 350 was all for corn in that example. This was a year ago. I put this slide together. So, you know, put whatever you want for corn price in today. The yield bump in beans, I saw 3 bushel. And interestingly enough, the yield bump in the 3 crop rotation was higher by 1/2 bushel than a corn bean rotation. So the oats were contributing more than the 2 years off of corn. It's given me an opportunity for cover crops that we don't otherwise get in our row crop system, and given me an opportunity for spreading manure if I'm a person with livestock. And a lot of people are looking for a place to maybe lighten the fall workload or just get some pits or something hauled out. For us, it's been splitting up our harvest work, which this last fall was beautiful, but the 2 prior to that, we were done before the snow, the rain, any of that crappy weather set in. And it's been really nice to have, you know, 1/3 of your acres out of the way before you walk into October. The straw, keep it, sell it, blow it back in the field. I figured a $75 an acre value if you're, you know, going to sell it in the windrow to your neighbor or somebody that's going to come in and bale it. For me, I have been baling it because I have a small square market that's been pretty good for me to put it to sell it into. If I didn't have that, I would have a really hard time giving that straw away, because in a big bale form, it's not worth a lot, or it's probably not worth in the bale form what it is in organic matter and fertilizer to blow back in your field. So if that small square market starts to slow up for me, I'm going to be really tempted to leave that residue back in the field. Grazing, I figure is adding about $20 an acre. And how I came up with that number is I've been getting paid somewhere between $1 and $1.25 per cow per day, as long as they're on my feed and not getting supplemented with the farmer's hay or whatever else that he's bringing me to feed them. And then, you know, having that 3rd crop also opens up some storage options or bin rental. If I would have had those 200 acres of small grain into corn and beans instead of the small grain. Well, on my farm, I would have needed another 25,000 bushel bin. And so if I have that bin, well, now I can rent it out, giving me $15 an acre, or I can save myself from building one and have adequate storage space. So adding all those together, if you can capitalize on all those benefits, I'm coming up with $205 an acre. And you can kind of pick and choose which ones are gonna work for your operation. But basically, I'm just showing that there is a rotational benefit to it. These are some of the chemicals that I'm using or have used. In oats, I've used 2,4-D. Yoakum turned me on to one called MCPA amine. I've really liked that one because of its effectiveness on the weeds, and based on what the U of M has done for research, has been the most crop safe, especially for the different growth stages. Yoakum informed me a number of years ago that 2,4-D is a good chemical, but it's something that you need to use early in the oats, and people are probably using it a little bit later than they should. And I don't know what kind of yield penalty there might be for that, but that's why I've stuck with the MCPA, and it's worked very well. Other ones I've used is Callisto and Bucktrill. I wrote Palisade on the bottom. If you don't know what that is, it's a plant growth regulator that's supposed to shorten and stiffen the stem. I played around with it a lot early, and got to see some visual results with it. One year in particular, there was a large yield increase to using it. And in the past couple of years, I haven't been using it simply because it does cost a lot. And 2 out of 3 years, it wasn't paying to use. Kind of depends on what kind of year you're going to have, though. If you got one of those years where you're going to have bad winds and heavy rains late, maybe it's going to pay. So that one needs a little more trial before I'm just going to implement it farm wide. In the beans, read labels like Yoakum talked about, the rotational restrictions, partially due to cover crop and no-till, and partially due to the rotations we want to have. Dual and outlook have kind of been our residuals of choice for corn and beans because they have the shortest plant back times and are the most friendly to cover crops and small grain. And like I said, we're getting into the canning crop a little bit too. Last year in beans, we skipped all residuals. We did have to make a 3-pass herbicide program, but in those 3 passes, it was all strictly just killing weeds, never putting residuals out, and had pretty good luck with it. Even and you say, well, you should with 3 passes, but from what I saw last year, it didn't seem like residuals were working that well anyway. So I'm kind of happy that that's the way we went with it. Here's an example of Palisade I had from the year that it paid very well. If you see the picture during the growing season when things are really green on the right there, that is the untreated check. And so what I noticed was that it headed out, the untreated check headed out sooner. And you can already see there that it's just a little bit taller. And we finally got some wind and rain once we were getting close to maturity. And so you can see in the picture on the right then what kind of difference that made. So the strip on the left that's lodged slightly, that was the untreated check taken from the opposite way again, and the strip on the right was treated. So that's the year that it did amount to a yield difference. That year in particular, that grain did stand back up, so we didn't have any harvesting problems. So where the yield came from, I'm not exactly sure, but it was there in that particular year. These are just some pictures of the cocktails that I've used. The first one, or the one on the right, is after we'd applied hog manure onto the cocktail mix. So we kind of gave it a boost there to give it such a nice color and big growth. The one on the left is probably a little more typical of what I've been getting lately, just because by the time we get the straw baled off and the cover crop drilled, and this last year we were waiting for rain, all of a sudden it becomes the third week of August before that stuff is growing. And by that time, we're losing a lot of daylight and heat. So I'm still getting something out of it. It's just not providing as much biomass as I was hoping for. These are some of the things that I've been playing around with in that cocktail mix. I'm always putting a grass in, a sedan grass, a sorghum sedan, depending on what I'm doing with it or what I can find for the money. And I had been running 10 pounds. I'm thinking about cutting that back to around 5. Buckwheat is one of my big favorites. I'm always putting that in at 2 to 5 pounds. Sometimes I put clovers in. I don't underseed the oats at all with clover, so those clovers are getting experimented with post harvest, and I haven't had a lot of luck with the ones I've been trying on establishment or overwintering. And part of that could be because maybe I'm putting too much seed out there and they're getting shaded out. Kale is another favorite of mine. Turnip if I'm grazing, rape if I want something else to hopefully overwinter, but I'm never putting more than 2 pounds total in. And if I'm grazing, I've actually been cutting that back to a pound, pound and a half, because those brassicas get so big and so leafy, they're shading a lot of things out. Sunflower is another one of my favorites. At first I was putting it in because I wanted something to look at and something to stop people on the highway. But after having it out there, even if it doesn't head out, I really like the taproot that a sunflower puts on. So from a root perspective, that's why I keep using that one. And then I'm always putting some ryegrass in, and started playing around with some hairy vetch this last year as trying to get another crop to overwinter. I'm always putting a winter rye or winter triticale in because I want something that will for sure overwinter. And going to corn, that stuff's getting sprayed off when it's fairly early anyway. Mind your seeds per square foot. In the seed industry, where I was talking about a minimum of 25 up to 35 plus. And with what I just got done talking about, those kinds of pounds and seeds, I'm way over that 35, which is probably why I should cut some of it back, and maybe I'll have a little more success with some of those seeds that I'm not right now. So why do we do it? Why do we do no-till? Why are we doing the small grain? I always tell people I've traded one set of problems for another. So there's headaches that I deal with now that my neighbors don't. There's problems that they're dealing with that I don't. And from what I'm seeing so far, the benefits are outweighing the problems, even though we have hard times where we might be calling our friends that are in this same predicament going, well, what are you doing? And how are we going to get through this? Well, the nice part is most of us that are doing this kind of stuff are willing to share that. And so we keep doing it. We've had success doing it. We've had failures, but we're liking what we're seeing and we're liking what we're doing. This year in particular, it's probably the small grain is probably a harder sell for a lot of people because of the crop prices. They're going to look at it and they're going to say, well, why should I plant small grain when I can make more money doing corn and beans? And that's back to the example you heard 20 minutes ago about, what kind of race are we in? I'm only 35, so I got hopefully a lot of years of crop production yet. And it's the long game that, it's the slide I pulled up earlier about the rotational benefits and what we're getting out of it, and being able to play around with animals grazing and the increase in the corn and the bean yields. We're seeing less disease and insect pressure from this. I last year first tried some conventional corn and didn't use insecticide on those rotated acres, and I'm hoping that I can keep getting by with that because of that break in the rotation. So that's what we're after. That's kind of the end goal. These are the places that you can find me if you like Twitter, like Facebook. I haven't been good at it lately, but I usually try to keep people up to date on what I'm doing in the spring, the summer, the fall, and show you what I'm seeing, try to make some videos, take some pictures about, growths, progresses, trials, stuff like that. With that, I'll take questions if there is any, or any more for Yoakum. There. Got them all bored to sleep, don't we?
Yeah, they all ran for the hills.
It's that $5 corn.
I'll
I
go,
have
Andy.
I have a rule of thumb about prices when it comes to for wheat. If wheat is twice the price of corn and two-thirds the price of soybeans, I'm in the game. Otherwise, corn will win out, or soybeans will win out.
Okay. Myron was wondering what I use for a drill with my mixes. I don't have a drill. I've been hiring that done as well. One of my neighbors, he has a 1560 John Deere. His has a grass seed attachment box on it. And I have run clovers through that grass seed box before. Otherwise, a lot of times I am just running them through the main box too. I got another friend that's got a CCS drill, a Deere one, whatever number that one was, but he's got the big commodity tanks, and both him and I both have ran cocktail mixes through that, and I don't see it sifting out bad. We haven't had a problem with that. So with all those different kinds of seeds, it seems like they do stay mixed well together. And maybe it's because of the diversity or how many seeds we're putting in there, but that's what we've been doing.
So to add to that, small grains, it doesn't matter which one, you can actually establish completely with your fertilizer floater. You just have to up the rate a little bit and then do a shallow incorporation. Heavy harrow works the best. Your seed placement, your depth control goes to hell for obvious reasons, but you compensate for that with the increase in seeding rate. I have a very large producer that walked away in just east of the valley in the central part. They operate about 40,000 acres, and they walked away from small grains about 15 years ago when corn boom started. They're back into small grains, but didn't want to go with $300,000 expense of getting a large air seeder back on the premises. And so they're doing it with the floater. You just have to then stomach the fact that it's going to come up uneven. It don't look as pretty. But we're not in the game of looking pretty. Although everybody now, laughs when the auto steer goes off and your rows go wonky. Like you weren't paying attention. Other questions?
I've had a question about fungicides, and if we're spraying a fungicide to control crop diseases, are we somehow damaging the beneficial fungicides on the soil surface as well?
So, by the way, I have to ask you, are you related to Doc Tiffany?
I am. Cousin.
The world makes sense again. So when it comes to fungicides, when we spray the fungicides, timing wise, the canopies are closed. So very little actually comes actually in contact with the soil surface. There's going to be some. And when we talk about systemic fungicides, one of the things that is really different from what you think as being systemic to what they actually are. They're locally systemic, which means that if you had a leaf, look at this is my leaf now, and that droplet hits it here at the bottom, you will only actually get lateral and upward movement of all classes of fungicides except the most recent one, which is an SDHI, which is one of the active ingredients in Moravis, ACE. That one is a little bit more systemic, but they will not end up in the roots. And so are there effects on the biota on the soil? Possibly, and I would have to do a literature search on that to make absolutely, but my first inclination, there's very little of that spray volume actually ever getting to the soil surface because you have a closed canopy.
So you could make the same argument with corn and beans then as well, you know, that you have such a dense canopy that it's okay to put those products on and not damage soil activity.
They'll have soil activity if you would apply them to the soil directly.
Yep.
I mean, they do have, but I would have to do a little bit more literature search on what is out there. I'm just going by, there's very little spray volume that would hit, but if you do a 5-leaf application, your canopy is closed in the case of small grains. The way fungicides are applied on corn at silking, right, or just before silking, you got 6-7 layers of leaves before you get into the soil surface. Beans on 30-inch rows is probably, because you are after white mold, there you probably have, especially if you use air assist sprayers, would be a little bit different ball game, because there you're actually trying to penetrate the canopy as best as you can. There's a question here from Myron, and I am completely in the dark, says, what are you saying is in great disagreement with Russell Hendricks' findings? So now you are indeed I now have to do
you know, I'll jump out and speak, but he participated with the North Carolina study on this on his land with the corn growers competition, and did trials and did soil testing for biology levels. And just one application of a fungicide took his soil biology to half rate level on those tests. So
I am going to look
great issue with it.
I'm going to look that up, because I'm going to have to first look at what the fungicides were that they used, because the DMIs, so your strobilurins and your triazoles, are locally systemic. They should not end up in the root system.
Yeah, and they did testing of multiple fungicides. It was not just one, and they didn't matter which one they used, but I do not remember how many they tested, but had found that no matter which fungicide applied, they reduced soil biology level with one application.
I'm going to look that up, Myron. Thank you.
Myron, that's the reason I quit using it in corn and beans, was listening to some people like that. And then also, I don't know if it's because of the no-till practices or cover crops or combination of everything. I have seen where the fungicides are not paying me dividends. So I quit using them in corn and beans, partially because of the money, but then partially because of what people like Russell and other, biologists are saying about fungicides. And that's one of the things that actually I don't like about the small grain is they are a little more dependent on a fungicide, are a little more apt to being hurt by funguses. And so I've been using them. I want to start leaving check strips to know what that's costing me on my own farm. But that is my hesitation to the small grain, is that as of now, I feel like I need to use them.
Well, and what you're saying, Andy, is it's been proven here too. We've got some neighbors growing oats, and the only way that they've made the test weight grade and had them stay standing, the guys that are using a fungicide can make the test weight and have the harvestability using fungicide. And so if I went back to a small grain, from what I've seen, I probably would use it for the yield benefit. But as far as corn and soybeans, I've been no-till long enough, cover crops, I do not see an economic return. At best, I break even, or I might make a couple dollars. It's not worth it to me to be using it on those crops.
Yeah. And I know I'm only using it once on oats. I know if you do wheat, you might have to go twice, once for the leaf and once for the head. But, I do know people that are raising oats that are, just blanket using 2 shots. And to try to limit that, I am going to only one, at flag leaf. So I'm not using it as often then.
Yeah, you have to repeat after me now, Myron. If I raise oats, I will use a fungicide to control fungi. Because I'm sorry, but all the varieties now are pretty much susceptible to crown rust. And it's in part because we no longer have the eradication program for buckthorn. And buckthorn is the alternate host in the case of crown rust in oats, which means that we are very quickly selecting for virulence against new resistance genes. And it's basically a race that we're losing, and because there's no longer the mandate to destroy buckthorn as there was in the 50s, outer shelter belts and everything else. And so, yeah, we're at a disadvantage. And the interesting thing is there's hyper regionality. So we give our variety trials, right? And we give a rating, and we update those ratings every single year for all the oat varieties. And you can see from somewhat susceptible to very susceptible. You might be in a pocket where you actually will not see any crown rust on a very susceptible variety because your population of the crown rust hasn't mutated to become virulent on that particular resistance gene. And so I hate to bring this to you, but you actually have to scout your oats. and not at 60 miles an hour. But the good thing is, because it's a polycyclical disease, in other words, we need multiple cycles of the disease to reach economic injury level. You can have some in the bottom of the canopy, and that will tell you whether or not you're going to need a fungicide or not. And that's when I said in my talk, call me, because we'll walk through that, where we're at in the season, what the immediate weather forecast looks like, because we very well understand the epidemiology of each of these diseases. The risk models that we have for leaf rust in wheat are pretty much the same weather risk models that you could use for crown rust, that I use for crown rust. They're very indicative. And so we are actually managing the crop then, rather than calendar spraying, because we don't always have to use a fungicide. But you have to be willing to do it. Because if you're not, and it's a very susceptible variety, and the crown rust runs through, there's two things that will happen. The canopy will completely collapse, because the crown rust basically gobbles up all the nutrients that's in that straw and weakens the straw to the point where it just will collapse. And if you are a big fan of green equipment, it will be red by the time you're done with harvest.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you that I think I made it clear. If I was growing oats in this area, I'd probably use it. My point was what your comment about not seeing any issue with the soil.
I'm going to look that one up.
You know, and you know, so yes, I would use a fungicide, but I would also counter oats, wheat. They are very, especially oats, are very fungal dominant root systems. So possibly they counteract, so it's a net zero effect on oats using it.
I just want to make a comment on test weight. Sometimes that's what scares people away from doing oats. And what did I say? I've been doing this 6 years. In the 6 years that we've been doing it, there was only one time that we didn't make test weight. And that was 2018, 19, when we had an exceptional amount of rain. Ironically, we didn't get a fungicide on. They fell down, went flat. And so those were light, and I had to figure out another way to get rid of them. The test weight thing scares a lot of people, and what I've found is that what I found and been told and wasn't told up front was that handling and storing for a short amount of time will increase that test weight. So the first couple of years we were harvesting oats, they'd come off the combine at 34, 33 pounds, and you go, shoot, well, that doesn't make it for grain millers 36 plus standard. Throw them in the bin. What are we going to do with them? Fine, we haul them to the elevator in a month, and all of a sudden they're crossing the elevator scale at 36, 7, 8 pounds. Well, where did that come from? Well, it's coming from handling them. I can pick up almost a pound just from running them through a drag conveyor, the grain leg up into an overhead, just from that little bit. So, you know, take an auger and grind them up into a bin, and you can get that or more. Once they go through their sweat, you know, it's like soybeans. You take them out of the field at 90 degrees, you got to blow the heat out of them, let them sweat. I'm picking up another pound or two. So whatever I'm coming off the combine at, I throw them in the bin for 2 to 4 weeks or 2 months, and I'm picking up 2 pounds, sometimes 3, 4 pounds. And if you still think you're light, a good friend of mine that's getting into small grain now too, he found that using a grain vac picked him up another pound, because he was unloading the bin with an auger, got to the end, pulled the vac out to clean out the bin, and pulled another pound out of them just with that. What do you got there, Joachim?
Okay, the fastest variety selection makes a difference, and it's basically days to heading. That explains the chance. You know, in Antigua is a variety that has inherently higher test weight in the trials. Camden is a very late maturity variety, actually out of Sweden, that came to us through Canada, and the difference in heading is, you know, about a week, but that's in Southern Min is enough to ding test weight across years on average. So that early planting is in a way to avoid basically heat, because that's a way to lose test weight. And then you can do, you know, if you're really worried about it, you have to go to the earlier maturing varieties or switch varieties if it gets really later with your planting date, which is a big hassle and probably not practical. But I have to give this talk later this afternoon. And it has less to do with days to heading, and yield there's nothing going on, and grain yield and grain protein, there's nothing going on either. It's really in the southern min heading date, so early maturing varieties give you a greater probability of getting higher test weight. That's basically what this slide says. In case you hadn't figured out, I am kind of a data wonk. And because I'm behind my computer at home, I can throw up more slides than you care for. Other questions, guys?
Hey, Joachim, do you think you could follow, I work with some Canadian firms where they're following their oats with like winter wheat, winter rye in a grain production that way. You get them in the ground earlier, especially like in southern Minnesota, central Minnesota, where if we get in that October range, we're running out of sunlight, we're running out of temperature, and we just don't get them established as much. Could we follow oats with winter wheat, with winter rye, winter trit? Would that be a feasible plan to go with?
Yeah, there's relatively little overlap in some of the fungal pathogens. There's some. Eventually, you run the risk of building up some of our root pathogens. But if you have a 2-year break between, if you go corn, soybeans, oats, winter wheat, back to corn, that 2-year break should help stave off that relatively long. But between harvesting the oats and establishing your winter wheat or rye or winter triticale, we are going to pay attention to a couple of things. Are you planning on baling the hay of the straw off of the oats?
No, we're going to blow it back in the field.
Okay. You have a good straw chopper where you don't see any ridges?
Yep.
Okay. Are you going to work the field at all or no-till?
No-till.
Okay. So in a no-till situation, you first have to hope for some rain, because I want whatever is blown over the back of the combine to germinate. When that germinate, I want you to actually terminate that.
Okay.
And the reason for it is we have a couple of viral diseases that could migrate between the two, as long as the aphids stay alive. That's called closing the green bridge. So you don't want to have volunteer oats present when the winter wheat, triticale, or rye gets established. The first one that I think of is barley yellow dwarf virus, red leaf and oats. As long as there's aphids. So the next thing you talk about is, can I start a little bit earlier with my winter cereals? Part of the reason I don't like you to is this green bridge. The second part of that equation is, and with rye, we have to do a couple of things. We have to learn a couple of things yet. But with winter wheat and winter triticale, which I kind of lump together because they're a little bit more alike compared to the hybrid rye. The second reason I don't want you to go too early in southern min is if the crop actually gets too lush in the fall, it actually is more prone to winter kill. Ideally, your winter wheat and triticale doesn't have to get much past the 3-leaf, which is where the beginning of tillering, and probably 2 to 3 tillers. That's when it's going to be the most winter hardy going into the winter. If you have it thicker than hair on a dog with 4, 5, 6, 7 tillers, and really lush where you have it You could graze it basically the way they do in, Texas, Kansas, etc. We probably run into more winter kill issues. That crown actually can get in a way too old and won't be as winter hardy. It's kind of an oxymoron. You think bigger plants, you should be okay. They're not. And we don't have enough period to graze them because you can't start grazing them until they're starting to tiller. Because you need those brace roots, basically the crown roots or the equivalent to brace roots in corn, for that bovine not to pull that seedling out.
Okay.
It's when they flip that little tongue around. If it's at the tree leaf stage, that whole plant will come up.
Sure.
Whereas if once they tiller that plant, you just graze it and it will start retillering and growing.
So when you're talking too early, what do you, time frame?
I don't like you to probably start until September 15th.
Okay. So in that time frame after the oats, if a guy went in with because we want to be as no-till as possible, but if we went in with like a heavy harrow, and just stirred that up to try to stimulate that growth of the oats to get it to come back, where we combine, it usually ends up being where that windrow laid down. It is a little thicker mat there, and that's going to be a problem issue, or a problem area there. So if we drug it and spread that out, try to get the oats to come, so we make sure we terminate them. Would that be we don't want to do full tillage.
But I think that approach, the heavy harrow, is just scarifying a little bit and spreading that mat that is inherent. That's basically the stuff that runs right underneath out of the combine that doesn't even hit the straw chopper. That's where you're going to see it to green up the most. And if you spread that out and scarify a little bit, that might be enough.
Okay.
And a little rain shower really helps that way.
Yeah, usually we don't have to worry too much about that. Usually fighting the rain, unless it's one of the few years that the rain got shut off for a while. But usually it's right on your tail. You don't get that chance to worry about not getting it up with the rain, and usually it's on its way. So, okay. Well, that's, we talked to these people up there, and they kept saying, the sunlight, we lose sunlight and it doesn't get as established as it should. But Div told me the same thing. You don't want it too big because that can winter kill because it's too big a plant then.
And Minnesota is awkward in the sense that we're a transition zone. We're in a way almost too extreme for the spring cereals because we very quickly warm up in the spring, but we still get frozen shut and really cold in the winter. And we don't have as consistent a snow cover as, for instance, most of Manitoba and a large part of Saskatchewan. And winter and snow is an absolute phenomenal insulator. So with ambient temperature of -40, if there's 4 inches of snow, your crown temperature is 28 degrees. And 28 degrees, the crop can hang out in that for months. We won't lose it. So in a no-till system, I've been trying to grow or done trials with winter barley. And if I can pull this up quick, just give me a second. Just a little patience. Let's see. I just parked this damn presentation. Well, Andy was talking. See, I shouldn't have moved it.
Well, he talks too much. That's his problem.
Okay.
No comment back, Andy? You're not going to say nothing back to me on that one?
Yeah, I'll just let you keep talking and prove it otherwise.
Tendency to do that.
So this is winter barley, basically in Crookston, where we actually no-tilled it into soybean stubble. That was 2 inches. That's not enough to trap enough snow. And I can winter kill it. But if I have in 6 inches or so of wheat stubble, winter wheat stubble, I can pull winter barley through even in Northwest Minnesota, probably 2 out of 6 years. And winter barley is, a tenfold less winter hardy than winter wheat is, and probably 20-fold less winter hardy than rye is. So winter wheat in a no-till system, what you do, we should be able to get through the winter almost everything. The thing that will kill it is flooding in the spring. Any low spots you're probably going to see anywhere there's standing water is where, because once we break dormancy, and we do that very quickly in winter cereals, because our sun has a lot of power by the time it gets to March, and our soils are black, so they warm up quick. Once that dormancy is broken, if they then go back into standing water, that's their Achilles heel. And so winter cereal stands will always be kind of messy, because you're going to have these spots where you're going to see some, because the tiles generally, you're going to have that layer where it's just frozen enough that the water isn't percolating down, and you're going to have these bald spots.
So when you talked earlier about raising the rates where those guys are spreading with the fertilizer spreader with the floater, how much are they increasing their rate, their seeding rate?
15 to 20%.
Okay.
And you learn, and you learn, in his case, that's because they're relatively sandy soil. They're sandy loams where they're at. They have a fair amount of Norwegian sugar beets in that area too. Rocks, in case nobody caught that one.
Yeah.
So they can get away with just 15 to 20. You're going to have to figure that out, play with that a little bit, or in your own circumstance, because your ground will dictate how much you can do with that harrow, how aggressive you have to be with that harrow, and then look at how deep and how shallow that seed is. In the case of oats, you can go as deep as probably 3 inches and still have it make it to the surface. In the case of barley, you have to be the most careful. You don't want to get much below 2 inches. Spring wheat, you can get to probably 2 to 2.5 and get good stand. Rye, you can probably get it down to 5 inches and it will make it to the surface. Kale is going to be more like wheat. So expect that stuff that is at 3 inches with wheat is going to have a tougher time getting, and you're going to see some stand reductions. And that you don't know until you have a feel for what your harrow does on your soil. They can go relatively mild with their harrows because it's pretty forgiving ground.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what if they harrowed it and pulled like a Brilliant Packer or a Brilliant Cully Packer? Would that work better, or is just the harrow good?
Perfect. They don't have one because all their equipment starts at 50 feet and goes up from there. The Cultipacker isn't as good as a Brilliant. I love a Brilliant. I've been looking for one. They used to have them around here because I want to stick one behind my plot planter when I do winter cereal, my winter wheat trials, and I haven't been able to find one. So if anybody has one in the windrow with a couple of basswoods through it, I'll bring my chainsaw. I only need 6 feet.
They're hard to find, and we went to a couple auctions looking for them, and they've brought some pretty good prices in the last couple of years because everybody's making cover crop seeders out of them. So they're been revived. The company should start making them again. Is what they should do.
Yeah, we called them where I grew up, we called them Cambridge rolls. I don't know if the University of Cambridge had anything to do with it, but we call them Cambridge rolls. You call them Brilliants here, but especially on heavier ground, simply because those elements are loose. You're not caking them up where, I don't know how much fun you think it is, but having to clean out those rolls isn't my idea of spending an afternoon.
Nope.
So from all that conversation, basically what I'm gathering then is that if I have, in my case, maybe a canning crop or a spring small grain, I don't want to plant a cover crop mix that I intend to terminate prior to planting that winter cereal.
No, I think you can, but you have to, so
Just make sure we're terminating.
Yeah,
Okay.
because you need about, so an aphid will leave a plant that's drying down. So you need to give your aphids about a week's time to get the heck out of Dodge if they're in
Okay.
that canopy.
Okay.
So
And
if you
so it's actually probably a good idea to give you the biomass for insulation, catching snow, all the stuff we were just talking about.
Yeah, so if you use sorghum Sudan and you would put it on, and you'd hate it after your canning crop, and you bale it, and you would actually seed that and cut it a little higher, terminate that then afterwards with glyphosate to just have it die off further. And glyphosate takes a little bit of time, so you give that a week and a half. Then that standing stubble, because the Sudan stubble is pretty sturdy. I would no-till into that. I'd feel comfortable with that.
And as far as yield and protein goes, if we can get winter wheat established, is that a better crop as far as marketability or price or yield or not compared to spring wheat, I guess?
So winter wheat tends to always be a little bit lower grain protein than spring wheat is. Most of the winter wheats are still susceptible to Fusarium head blight, so so the genetics aren't as good, and that means, but they head earlier and their grain fill is earlier, so you rely partially on escape. So it's a little bit of a balance. If we have these nicer Aprils where we don't have these dang snow blizzards on April 15, we're getting a little bit longer view again. Remember what I talked about, that Minnesota is really this transition zone? And now I'm going to use a word that, and don't click me away right now, but if climate change is real, and the consensus is that it is, and I'm not a climatologist, eventually southern Minnesota will be like central Missouri. It will be like Kansas City and eastern Kansas. That puts us in winter wheat belt, because now your growing season is really gets too short, because what is predicted for Minnesota is milder winters where we don't have necessarily, but wetter winters with more snowfall, where we will have not the temperature extremes that we used to have. The T minuses are actually coming up more. So the nighttime lows are coming up more than the daytime highs. So we're still going to have winter. Don't kid yourself. But we don't have these minus 40s, stretches of minus 40s. This is what I'm telling when the temperature this morning was at minus, whatever. And then April and May are going to be cooler and wetter because there's more water in the system. Overall, we're going to get wetter, and water holds a lot of energy, which means that April and May are actually going to be cooler and damper. And then we switch on to where June and July are hotter. where we're going to see higher humidities with a greater frequency of what Mark Seeley used to call weather singularities. Those are the 6-inch thunderstorms, or the derecho that happened in Iowa last year. Those are called those extreme weather events. Well, the frequency of those is going to go up supposedly, as well as the intensity. If you pack that all together, I might finish my career as a winter wheat specialist if I stay around long enough. And I don't know when that transition point is. I don't. Because again, it's about risk. If you now plant winter wheat 3 years in a row and it freezes out 2 years in a row, you say, Wiersma, you're full of it. You're an idiot. But it goes back to those discussions early. I can't make that decision for you as far as your appetite for risk between winter wheat and spring wheat. I can only show you the data, and I can tell you when things miserably failed and why they failed. No-till, I think, is an integral part of winter cereals, except for winter rye, because it just changes catching that snow, especially when we have that warm-up in March that's going to happen, where we're going to have 2 60-degree days in Worthington. You can almost put you could go to Vegas with those odds, because it's going to happen. And all of a sudden, all the snow is gone, except for the areas that have no-till. Because there's just enough, a little bit more snow, that you don't break that dormancy on that winter wheat. And that just carries it. It's another way of managing that risk again. Does it make sense, Andy?
Yeah, it does. Stick with spring wheat is kind of what I gathered.
Yeah, I think spring wheat is a little bit better bet, but you have to be willing to walk away from those acres and go to plan B. If you can't get it in early, plan B.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about the year that we did have poor test weight on oats. That was when we were drilling oats, May 1st or whatever. That super late spring we had a couple years ago, and then was wet, and it was a horrible small grain year.
Yeah.
Well, and one more quick comment on this. So putting the cocktail mix in after the oats going to the small grain for the fall, could you establish like a clover joachim in that? And if you could set the clover back or roll it down to prevent it so that the small grain can come through, would that be a viable option to have that overwinter with the small grain?
I don't know. We would have to, I have to go into the literature see if some of the Europeans have done something similar. I know that in England, there was some work done with interseeding clovers in the fall in winter wheat, but they did that for a completely different reason, suppression of fungal diseases, because they use that for most of the fungal diseases like tan spot and septoria or residue borne. And so the residue harbors the survival structure, and the survival structure germinates, makes the little parathecia, the little mushrooms, and then you get ascospores off of those. And the idea was, if we have that cover of clover in there, you don't get the splash dispersal. That's the research that I know of. I would have to look that up. I don't know. You guys come up with more scenarios than Carter has pills.
That's what we're good at. That's what we're asking you, the expert, because you have all the answers. So we have all the questions.
No, I can only have answers if I can make a scientific wild ass guess based on biological principles, or I can do the research. I prefer plan B in that case.
The wild ass guess sometimes goes a long ways with us to start with. At least I guess what I get is we're trying to establish, like Andy said, Andy and I work pretty close together on a lot of stuff. And that establishment of clover has been something that's been somewhat of a challenge for us in these cocktail mixes. We're thinking the seed size is smaller, so it's not as viable.
Yeah.
Maybe herbicides, maybe some shading. So we look at like a vetch, like he's trying hairy vetch. We've used a common vetch because it's a little bit bigger seed, but then it gets to be a cost thing too. It costs a little bit more to do it. So just trying to get more things out there.
So oats, sorry, clover is like alfalfa, small seeded, light germinator, has to be shallow, and it's a slow bugger. So if I would not put the oats in the mix because oats is too freaking competitive. If you want the legume portion of your mix, because you want to have nitrogen credits, remember how they used to fertilize ground? Plow down of clover.
Right.
You know, up to the 70s in the Red River Valley, the recommendation for sugar beets was a plow down of clover the fall prior. You didn't fertilize beets with nitrogen. Now, part of that was because this ground was so rich, they really didn't need to. But the recommendation was you use a plow down of clover. That's a green manure crop, and that's perfectly fine. But it's the biology of the species is such that slow to establish, isn't competitive, needs to be shallow seeded, and then needs water to germinate. It's kind of finicky. Your brilliant role is an absolute essential when you want to establish all that small seeded stuff.
Yeah, it does the best job of establishing. It's just like you said, not everybody has them, and it's possibly an extra pass over the field. So, yeah. But if you want it to work, you know, we've run stuff through drills, and I know we've dug down and found clover leafed out under the ground and it died. So, you know, we know we get it in too deep there. Well, then the other part is the competition side of it. Everything else takes.
And oats is the most competitive there is.
Right.
But clover seed is expensive compared to oats.
Well, sometimes it is. Yeah, it can be. It depends how much you want to put out there too. You know, if guys are trying to seed 8-10 pounds, that can get kind of spendy. We do 2-3 pounds in a mix because it's 260 some thousand seeds per pound, and 2-3 pounds goes a long ways in a mix.
Other questions? Since we now are in what I would call Stump the Chumps section of the program. I miss click and clack on public radio. I'm sorry.
All right, last chance. Put your questions in if you've got them. Excellent. All right. Well, I do want to announce the winner of the t-shirt is Myron. So Myron, I'll be getting a hold of you to figure out how to get that sent to you. And I want to thank everyone for participating. This was a really great conversation. But I also really want to thank Andy and Yoakum for taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us today. Greatly, greatly appreciated.
You're welcome. And if you have follow-up questions and really want to get into the weeds, because I gave a little bit more of a general talk, email me.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'll second that. If you, anybody that's trying to do small grain, Yoakum is a huge resource. I have to send him pictures and call him all the time. I am not a disease expert, so he's very helpful if somebody's trying to get into it and you're out in your field wondering, what is this and what do I do about it?
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great day and stay warm. The warm-up's coming. Yeah.
Thank you.
See ya.